This case involves the death of Nipsey Hussle, and they're given the background here. So he lived most of his life in South Los Angeles. He became an associate and then a member of a local street gang called the Rolling 60s. He was a fixture in his later teens and then in his early 20s at businesses near the intersection of Slauson and Crenshaw. So we know he had that marathon store, and then there were other businesses that he had, and these were the businesses where he was providing jobs to people in the community. They say that, his life and his activities started to change when he was, going into his late teen years and 20s. So he was getting away from, the gang activities and moving into music. And so we'll actually see that there was testimony from, what you could call one of his OGs was like, listen, this gang life, and he was an older member of the Rolling 60s. It was like, hey, you got to get out of this. If you want to have, if you want to live a good life, then you need to get out of this. You have opportunities. You're a smart dude. So he started making music, right? And so the ultimate hustler story, hustling music out of the trunk of his car, getting popular in the underground circuit. He started becoming sought after by major labels. He signed a deal, and then, Victory Lap came out, and right out the gate, first major release was nominated for a Grammy. And listen, I had that as my number 2 that year. So for me, I had Daytona. Daytona was my number 1, Pusha T, and then I had Victory Lap as number 2. That's something special to come out of that neighborhood, be a former gang member, and then, your first album out the gate gets nominated for a Grammy. That just goes to show how special he is. And so like they say, he had fans all over the world. The target, so they don't call a person who is being accused. They're not called the defendant yet. They're called the target. So that was Mr. Holder, who also grew up in LA, South LA, became a member of the Rolling 60s gang, so this Crip gang. So we're going to hear from quite a few people in this, in the grand jury testimony, and then also, at trial, you're going to hear from a number of people who were members of this Rolling 60s gang. And so, interestingly enough, Mr. Holder, and this is something that I'm going to ultimately point out that didn't seem to get as much attention as I think it deserved, but he was also a rapper. So he was an aspiring rapper. He was not nearly, you can't even say they were in the same stratosphere in terms of the success, but he was an aspiring rapper. And so what they're saying is the case involved the shooting and killing of Nipsey Hussle, and then shooting and injuries to Kerry Lathan and Sherman Villanueva on March 31st, 2019. And so, he goes into talking about some of Nipsey's successes on the business side, and how he would, there's testimony that he would go and check in. And interestingly enough, Nipsey did not roll around with security when he was going back to these businesses. So people testified that, hey, Nipsey would just roll up, and he, when he went out on tour, he would have security, but when he was just going to the store to check in on things, he would come out, sign autographs, he would take pictures, he would talk to people, just a man of the people. And so eventually, on this particular date, Eric Holder showed up, right? And so it wasn't anything that was planned. He just happened to show up, and he didn't know Nipsey was going to be there. There was nothing to suggest that he was already going to be there. And so he was with someone else that they're calling witness number 1. All right. So they don't disclose her name for her protection. Right. So because, what you'll come to find out is Mr. Holder was in witness number 1's car. She was the one who had drove him to the location. And then after he's alleged to have shot Nipsey and these other 2 individuals, he went back to that car, and then they took off. And so for her own protection, because again, you can see on Twitter, there was a lot of talk about, the the green light on Eric Holder. You know, so if he hadn't been picked up, if he wasn't taken into custody, then he probably could have been killed in the streets. And so naturally, without people not necessarily knowing how this thing went down, people probably would have assumed that witness number one was in on it, and you know, and therefore she might have to go too. So they've done what they can to keep her her public or her personal information out of the public eye. But nonetheless, eventually Holder goes and has a conversation with Nipsey. Right. And that conversation they're saying is really important, because at some point Nipsey mentioned, and there will be there will be testimony. There will be testimony that Nipsey had brought up something to the effect that Holder might have been snitching, which, you know, there will be expert testimony, and there will also be, you know, testimony from some of the witnesses about how serious of an accusation that would end up being. And so the other interesting part is that this conversation, it wasn't intense. There wasn't, you know, there was no animosity between Nipsey and Holder. It never really got heated. It was just kind of a matter of fact conversation. But then eventually he leaves and goes back to the car, and they drive around a little bit, and he starts to eat the food that he went to get before having the conversation with Nipsey, and then basically instructs witness number one, tells her to kind of pull over, and eventually he grabs his gun, he gets out of the car, and witness number one testifies that she heard shots being fired, and then obviously the people that were at the scene heard shots being fired, and eventually Holder runs back to the car, and then they take off. So that's basically, you know, what their opening statement was, and that's essentially what you'll hear is the basic facts of the case.